We're going to start off by just reflecting for a moment on why we're here, because I suspect that quite a few people are here because they're worried about climate change and maybe want to understand the implications for themselves, for society, and maybe what we can do about it. So there was a moment in the book, Clayton, which of course everyone should read. I learned a huge amount even as a PhD in neuroscience. Would you like to read us the letter from the glacier?
I'm happy to, yes. And thanks so much for having me in Brighton. I've never been here. And in fact, I've never given a talk in a pub before. And had I known that it was an option to have a beer up here with me, I maybe would have taken advantage of that. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say no. This is from the very first chapter in the book, which is actually on memory. And I'll just give you a little bit of preamble before I go into the letter that Dr. Ray mentioned. This is a scene that takes place on the southern, oh my gosh. We're coming back here. This is a scene that takes place on the south coast of Iceland, talking about a dead glacier. So the glacier is called Ökjökull. That's the word that you need to keep an eye out for, I suppose an ear. Unlike Breidamörjökull in the south, Ökjökull has been small to begin with. In 2014, it had lost so much mass that glaciologists determined it no longer met the definitional criteria of a glacier. It was rocks interspersed with occasional ice, and the ice wasn't thick enough. They deregistered the glacier 700 years after it had become one. When activists caught wind of the change in status a few years later, they produced a short documentary film about the life and death of Ökjökull. They interviewed Icelanders about the landscape, about what glacial death meant to them. And then they held a funeral up on the old shield volcano where the glacier once reigned. Children present that day at Ökjökull present a bronze plaque memorializing something onto a slab of basalt at the site of the former glacier. It was a makeshift tombstone standing in protest of forgetting. It was a different kind of weather memory bank. The funeral implied that there were others worth saving, that death doesn't always need to imply loss. As the Icelandic writer Andri Snær Magnusson observed in interviews for the documentary, one of the most striking aspects of contemporary life is that geologic time is merging with human time, that we can watch stories that took centuries to write now rewind in a generation. Can we rewrite a glacier? How do you compose a history of forgetting? The plaque is adorned with Magnusson's words, first in Icelandic and then in English. A letter to the future. Ökjökull is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. August 2019, 415 parts per million CO2.
Thank you, Clayton. I had goosebumps. So, as this has indicated, this is the most pressing matter of our time. How did you go from being a neuroscientist to working on how climate change is affecting us as humans? Why did you want to write this book?
Thank you for that question. I have some semblance of an answer, though it's been a little bit of a circuitous path. I, unlike Dr. Ray, did not finish my PhD. I was in the middle of it, and I worked in computational neuroscience, and in part that meant doing something very exciting, modeling the brain with statistics and machine learning and digital signal processing and all that fun stuff. And in part, it also meant I was just looking at a computer screen all day in a kind of a basement windowless lab, which felt a little bit disconnected from the beauty and intuition and ephemerality, but permanence, right? The excitement of the brain that I was in the business for the first place. And so, it dawned on me that there was probably a different way to begin to ask those questions that didn't involve looking at a computer screen all day, and instead perhaps could indeed involve talking to people and witnessing myself in the real world. And so I left neuroscience for journalism, ultimately by way of public policy. I did another graduate degree in public policy, and in particular, as somebody who had come from the sciences, became interested in science policy. What is the most pressing science policy question of the day? It's climate policy. And so by way of climate policy, found myself eventually writing for an environmental magazine, and my first editor at this environmental magazine asked me, well, hey, you're a neuroscientist. Surely there's some kind of series to be written, this is your brain on climate change. Can you do that for me? And the first thing I said was, well, no. A, because there's no science there. B, even if I could find any, I would immediately alienate all my former neuroscience colleagues because, neuroscience, as you well know, neuroscience is already the thing that is, so readily sensationalized in the popular press. I mean, how many articles have you read that have that headline, this is your brain on X, and then it's a sample size of like 4 people, who have, sniffed some smell in an fMRI scanner, and all of a sudden, you've got a finding that appears in something like Popular Science. And so I was very skeptical of this notion that there might be some kind of series to be written on neuroscience and climate change, but this editor was my boss, so I did what he told me to, and I'm very glad I did, because as I began polling at these threads and beginning to understand that the fact that we all feel a little bit more aggressive in the heat, the fact that we're not as good at solving problems in the heat, right? The fact that we don't get as great a sleep at night during a heat wave, and then the next day need to adjust our behavior accordingly, all of this stuff adds up. And there is actually real brain science underlying some of the behavioral effects we feel in the face of environmental change. And so these initial investigations ended up undergirding this foundation that over the course of 6 or 7 years, ultimately resulted in the book in front of us.
By the way, we do some of those sniffing tests on the university campus in our MRI brain
Good.
scanner.
Excellent, excellent.
But on much larger sample
I was going to
sizes.
say hopefully more than 4 people before you publish.
And with the aim of publishing in scientific journals rather than certain media outlets,
good,
which
good.
we won't name.
Excellent.
And one thing in the book's opening that really struck me, Clayton, about your kind of journey towards writing the book was the moment when you were meant to be doing some neuroscience analysis in the basement, but your friend had sent you a Pentagon report. What did that Pentagon report say?
Yes, so this is from the Department of Defense in the United States, and it was a report that laid out the notion of climate change as a quote-unquote threat multiplier. And it was the idea that rising seas, damaged infrastructure, rising temperatures, right? These are all bad in their own right, and certainly as a country, as a security institution, the Department of Defense, the United States, they ought to care about that kind of stuff. But that's not actually what the authors of the report thought was most frightening about climate change. What they said was that it's the manner in which it can exacerbate existing socio-political tensions that's most concerning here. And they're citing all these papers from behavioral economics and psychology that illustrate that indeed you can look at the city level, you can look at the intercity level, you can look at the national level, the international level, basically at every scale of analysis. When you correct for every socioeconomic variable under the sun, there still appears to be a reliable effect that illustrates a relationship between rising temperatures and the risk of conflict. And that, to me, right, if you scrub away the anthropology and the geopolitics and the sociology, and still you can find a relationship, right, a measurable statistical relationship between heat and violence, right? The neuroscientist inside me says, why? What is it about heat that makes us more behaviorally or psychologically prone to aggression? How is that possible? How is that something that humans have evolutionarily learned is a necessary behavioral response? And so that was kind of the other moment where I said, I can't look at the screen anymore. I need to start talking to people about why it is that we respond in the way that we do in the heat.
And it spoke to me also because it turns out we've got similar origin stories in that respect, that when I was writing my neuroscience dissertation, instead of reading about the prefrontal cortex and dendritic spines, instead I'd seen a media headline about a report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I looked it up and I read it. And it said by 2050, 50% crop failures, 50% reduction in available water. And where my mind went with that was armed conflict and mass migration. Yeah.
Yes.
And that sat with me and it's never left me. I didn't quite change career in the way that you have, because I just couldn't also put down an interest in the brain. But through my academic career, I found increasingly more and more I wanted to do what I could within my sphere of influence, because that kind of haunting of mass migration and armed conflict had never left me.
Yes.
And by 2050, I calculated back then, I was 20, I would be 63. And I thought, well, presumably I'll still be around
Yes.
to see it. So this isn't something abstract for, our grandchildren or in 200 years' time. This is something that's going to affect all of us.
Yes. Well, and so much of this book for me is about the attempt to take the abstraction of climate change, which is this amorphous, border-crossing, generation-crossing blob that is often spoken of in terms of 2050, in terms of 2100, and pull it into the present and into us and say, climate change is here now. It is affecting the degree to which we are aggressive, the degree to which we can solve problems. As I'm sure we'll talk about tonight, it is affecting the habitable range of the disease vectors of brain disease, right? It is increasing the flux of neurotoxins in our environment. It is bearing on anxiety, depression, pain processing, sensory perception, right? These are all things that are happening today because of a changing climate. And that, to me, at least on an emotional level, is an infinitely more profound statement than, by 2100, something bad is probably going to happen.
Yeah. And there's a theme that you introduce early in the book, but that really carries through, and that was always running through my mind, that whether it's how it affects our cognition, whether it's how it affects neurodegenerative diseases, there's this theme around what's a marginal effect for us as individuals really adds up once you get to the population level. So there's this fantastic data on productivity at work, and how a heat wave can lead to a 5% decrease in blueberries picked in fruit farm pickers. And maybe by itself, that seems like, oh, okay, you just had a bad day at the office. But add that up over a whole economy, that's really quite substantial. That's not far off the dip in the economy that we had during the peak of COVID.
Yes.
And I feel there's a really strong parallel here with what's going on with climate change, where at an individual level, you might feel our actions don't add up, don't matter. So, me driving to work every day isn't causing climate change. But add that up over the whole population, add that up over the whole world, and suddenly those marginal little things really start to add up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, again, I feel certainly more prone to something like an aggressive act on a hot day, and yet I'm never going to raise my hand and say, oh, it was the difference between 39 degrees and 40 degrees, that made me punch the man next to me on the bus. Right? That's not how it works. We don't interpret causality psychologically in that manner. These effects are often only expressed at the level of the population. And so, so much, I think, of the behavioral science here is, in fact, only useful when understood in aggregate. And this is true in terms of the cognitive effects. It's I think, true in terms of, some of the relationships between air pollution and dementia, between rising carbon dioxide concentrations and cognitive processing, right? And again, we see this borne out in the education system, for example. Again, maybe if you're a student taking a test You're going to feel a little sluggish on a hot day, but you're not going to be able to pinpoint the fact that it was the specificity of one temperature that made the difference between you getting question 38 correct versus incorrect. And yet, we know, because of very careful behavioral economic studies, because of very careful climate economic studies and epidemiological estimates of these kinds of things, that in the United States, for example, where there's a disproportionate distribution of air conditioning, that the presence of air conditioning in the communities where it's available actually explains, again, correcting for all the other socioeconomic variables under the sun, the disparate distribution of air conditioning accounts for something on the order of 5% of the racial achievement gap in the United States. And so at the population level, we observe an astounding statistical truth that may be less evident at the level of the individual child, but that makes it no less true.
Yeah, absolutely. And the heat wave data really spoke to me, particularly with regards to function of the prefrontal cortex. So this is the big bit of your brain just behind your forehead, which has to work really hard at your most cognitively demanding tasks. When you're at work, your prefrontal cortex has to work hard to keep you on track with your task instead of getting distracted, fiddling on your phone. It has to work really hard to keep in mind your plan for the day, what your to-do list is, and flexibly perhaps altering the tasks that you're working on if an urgent request has come up from my boss to write a series on climate change in the brain. Unfortunately, the prefrontal cortex is exquisitely sensitive to sleep deprivation. Even before we bring in the effects of heat wave on sleep, there's so much data showing that that's the case. One bad night's sleep and the prefrontal cortex can really drop off in terms of things like your decision making and making the right judgment call in say, like work situations. So to me, it wasn't a surprise that a heat wave could have those cognitive effects, given what we know from other studies, but your data really made it more explicit for me, yeah. But do you think there's anything protective that we might be able to do around this? Obviously air conditioning, but the problem is that then requires a load of energy.
Yes.
But are there other things that we could do to really keep ourselves well rested and well topped up that might perhaps buffer us a little bit?
No, it's a great question. The answer is yes, and in many cases, unfortunately, the answer is kind of a concerning no. And in particular, what I mean by that is, right, air conditioners are great. Sign me up. In fact, they can be quite an equitable force in terms of technological solutions, but they're a stopgap, right? Because for the reasons Dr. Ray mentioned, given the current distribution of the global energy mix, right, the use of air conditioners is only going to exacerbate the climate problem. And yet, they work. They work insofar as if you are cooler, right? And this is also true of air filtration systems, right? This is true of, for example, wearing really serious masks if you are walking through the smoke of a wildfire or something like that, or a really dirty street. All that stuff is relatively neuroprotective, super duper. The problem is, it takes a while for our bodies to adapt, right? And so we have lots of these studies that illustrate that even people in air-conditioned environments, if they've been exposed to extreme heat on a given day, are still liable to experience some of the neurocognitive deficits that result from exposure to that heat, right? It takes a while for you to reach that set point again, which makes sense. I mean, we've all felt this. If you've had to run to a bus, or indeed run to work because you're going to be late or to class or something like that, when you ultimately sit down, it takes you a while to feel normal again. And that sense of normality that you're reaching, right, that's homeostasis. That is your body in metabolism working, right, physically working to get back to the point that feels good, right? So the same strains that a lack of sleep put on that prefrontal cortex, right, heat places those strains as well in the form of effectively an additional cognitive load, right? You're having to almost physically juggle more as a function of heat, and with an overworked prefrontal cortex, right, you end up seeing outsized influence of some of the more, emotional or impulsive decision-making centers in the brain. And we see this, again, reflected at the population level. There's this really compelling study that came out of Ottawa a couple years ago that illustrates that U.S. immigration judges on hotter days are less likely to side with asylum applicants, right? And the effect is strong enough such that it basically explains the difference between, the 25th and the 75th percentile in terms of leniency of these judges. That if you are a more lenient judge, given a heat wave, you'll kind of end up looking like you're a more conservative, a less lenient judge. Right? It's also true, for example, that on hotter days, members of the U.S. Postal Service are more likely to file racial discrimination or sexual harassment claims. They're more likely to file union grievances. Again, this is presumably picking up on the fact that there are more instantiations of these types of aggressive or indeed otherwise insidious events on those days. And as in the case of the judges, who are these allegedly objective decision makers sitting in air-conditioned buildings, this effect in the Postal Service was true not just of people working outside delivering the mail, but also of those who worked inside air-conditioned post offices serving clients as they came in the door. And so again, we can cool ourselves. There are fabulous psychological studies that say, in fact, even picturing a colder environment, picturing a bunch of ice cubes while you're working on a task can correct some of the neurocognitive deficits of heat, right? Or strapping a cold pack to your forehead is useful, right? We can bridge some of the gap here, but ultimately it takes a while for your body to adapt, and people are not infinitely adaptable.
There's several passages in the book that really hammer home for me that the human impact of increased aggression during heat waves. But one that I found funny, not funny, but funny, because it made me reflect on, am I doing my research wrong of like putting people in MRI scanners? Actually, I need to be hiding in a bush with a clipboard, looking at a traffic light, because there's this I'm sorry, I found it so funny. But
no, it's hilarious. I mean, that's why I quoted at length, because it's funny.
Yeah, this fabulous story about how many car honks are made. When you tell the story, you'll tell it better than me.
I did a study from the 80s in Arizona in the United States, extremely hot, extremely dry climate. A couple of psychologists developed this scheme whereby they have a confederate, right, an experimental participant idling in a vehicle in front of a light. And when the light turns green, they just fail to move. And then somebody in a bush off to the side sits with the clipboard and records with a stopwatch the length of the honks that result behind this idling vehicle, the frequency of the honks, the number of expletives that are yelled, right? The latency in terms of how long does it take for somebody to start honking, and then the light turns red and the experimental participant just makes a right turn on red and moves on with their day, leaving everybody extremely flustered. And of course, there's a relationship, unfortunately, between heat and propensity to honk, and length of honk, and latency to honk. And it's a relationship that is more extreme in vehicles that have their windows rolled down, because presumably those folks don't have air conditioning in their vehicles and are even more exposed to the heat in question. So this stuff is everywhere we look. There's the baseball pitchers have a greater propensity to strike batters on the opposite team with their pitches on hotter days, and they are more likely, even so, to retaliate in this manner if members of their team have been hit in this fashion. So it's not even just the fact that there's an increased propensity to aggress. There appears to be an increased propensity to retaliate. It's true that American football penalties are more aggressive in the heat. Chess players are less good at playing the game that they are allegedly wired to play when it's hot, or greater levels of air pollution. The complexity, this is a fun one, the complexity of speeches given by Canadian members of Parliament decreases as a function of air pollution, right? People are literally forming less complex sentences. in the heat and at higher levels of air pollution. So the stuff is everywhere. It's inescapable. It is part of who we are. And I think so much of this conversation and so much of what I'm seeking to communicate in the book is that this is a shared universal experience, right? This stuff is here. And we've mostly been talking about the cognitive effects thus far, but the neurodegenerative effects, right, the brain disease effects, these relationships between landscape loss and climate anxiety and depression, right, they are with us now. And I think it is in our best interest to name and acknowledge and reckon with them before, indeed, the effects at the aggregate level continue to grow to the point of being unignorable.
Yeah. So I'd love to pick up on some of that neurodegenerative data. For me as a neuroscientist, that was the point at which I was frightened. The prefrontal stuff, that's explainable to me. I could have expected that. I did not know about what was going on in terms of neurodegeneration. So this is a biological process. You might have heard of various forms of dementia, say like Alzheimer's disease. And this is a biological process that we still don't fully understand ourselves as neuroscientists. But basically there's a process going on in brain cells that starts to choke the brain cell from within, and you get these kind of build-up within the brain cells of proteins that then make the brain cell struggle to function, and gradually it then dies. And at the start of chapter 2, Clay, you said people are second lie, people are infinitely adaptable. And everything you've just said tells us people are not infinitely adaptable. We have hard physical limits, and the neurodegeneration data really brought that home to me. There's another parable here for ecosystems. Like, this planet is not infinitely adaptable. There is only so much fossil fuel we can burn before it's all gone. There is only so much peat wetland we can restore in the name of so-called offsets. There's only so much metal we can mine to make wind turbines. So would you like to tell us a little bit about these hard physical limits, particularly in the brain?
Happy to. Brain disease is relatively easy to wrap our heads around in terms of the relationships between climate and the spread of disease vectors, right? If a warming world increases the habitable range of ticks and mosquitoes or vampire bats, right? All the kind of stuff that cause scary things like yellow fever and cerebral malaria, even if we don't do anything different in our daily lives, people as a society are more likely to come into contact with these disease vectors and contract the brain diseases in question. That is relatively intuitive. Here's something that Dr. Ray mentioned that is slightly less intuitive and no less frightening. So all over the world are organisms called cyanobacteria. They're also known as blue-green algae. You may have heard of them as harmful algal blooms because during warmer months, especially in the summer in places with fresh water, you tend to see these large blooms grow. And it's well known that a handful of these harmful algal blooms produce some form of toxin that has encouraged regulators to say, well, don't swim in the water when these blooms are present, because we know that they can kill animals, for example, and they can therefore probably kill people. Let's stay away from the blooms. Unfortunately, what very careful neurologists are beginning to learn is that one particular neurotoxin that is released by the blooms in question appears to be airborne. And this is a toxin called beta-methylalanine, right? Beta-methylaminoalanine, BMAA. And BMAA, which is produced by a variety of cyanobacteria, appears to be one of the most compelling causal risk factors for the neurodegenerative disease ALS. This is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, also known as motor neuron disease. So ALS, horrifying neurodegenerative condition. It mostly strikes people in the prime of life. It's basically a progressive paralysis of your body that results ultimately in death because the muscles that control your respiratory function cease to function at the end, and you can no longer breathe. So ALS is most frequently not a genetic disease. Only something on the order of 5% of cases, 10% of cases have a clear genetic origin. The other 90%, and by the way, this is true of most neurodegenerative diseases. Parkinson's, for example, Alzheimer's, most of these diseases have something on the order of 10% cases that are explained genetically. The other 90% are what are called sporadic cases. They just happen. People don't know why. What we do know is that there is probably something out there in the world, some environmental exposure that is interacting with our unique biology as individuals over the course of a life, and perhaps it's more than one, that ultimately results in the manifestation or the presentation of these diseases in people. Okay, so I said probably results in, or an interaction between an environmental factor and a genetic factor. We can actually be more specific than that because of some very interesting mathematical epidemiology. What we know in the case of ALS, for example, is that it actually takes something on the order of 6 specific genetic environmental interactions for the disease to present. And we can narrow it down to that number by looking basically at the age at which people contract the disease and back out the number of times that they must have had some kind of mutation result as a function of some interaction they've had with the environment. So what we know is that if you take all the environmental exposures under the sun and in a statistical model ask whether or not they can explain the variance, both temporal and geospatial, which is to say both as a function of time and space, ask the extent to which any of these environmental factors can explain the variance in case rates of ALS around the world, BMAA takes the top spot in terms of how much it can explain, which is to say there appears to be a causal relationship suggestive of ALS in its 6 steps, its 6 hits that it takes to present, being characterized by one of those steps constituting a BMAA exposure. Now, this is, of course, by definition, not to suggest that living next to a cyanobacteria bloom, which are all over the world, is going to give you ALS, because cyanobacteria in its own right and BMAA, the toxin in question, can only ever amount to one of those steps. The other 5 might come from air pollution exposure. They might come from some kind of environmental stressor that we have yet to find that has interacted with your genetics in a certain way. You may have some predisposition to a protein misfolding process that has been with you your whole life, and when it comes into contact with a certain glucocorticoid response, some kind of stress response in your body, that manifests as a mutation, that manifests as indeed one of these steps. But the problem is, right, if you do have 5 of your boxes checked and you experience chronic exposure to BMAA, well, then it will likely be the case that you come down with the disease in question. And so to me, what's frightening about the evidence is the fact that you have these causal risk factors that, because of a changing climate, right, because cyanobacteria blooms are increasing in size and frequency because of climate change for 2 reasons. One, extreme storms are more likely to loose synthetic fertilizer from agricultural operations into streams and rivers. What does this storm runoff do? It therefore fertilizes everything it touches, including blue-green algae blooms. 2, cyanobacteria bloom in warming waters, which is happening pretty much everywhere. So as a function of a changing climate, what's frightening here is that we're supposed to be keeping an eye out for an invisible exposure that we know is likely growing in kind as a function of this environmental change, and yet there's no regulation on the books. That's right. As we mentioned, folks are encouraged not to swim in water that is experiencing a blue-green algae bloom, but there's no government in the world that says don't live next to one, and don't breathe the air when you see one. But it is likely the case that in terms of these progressive neurodegenerative conditions, exposure to these neurotoxins constitutes a discrete step that you may take over the course of your life that ultimately manifests in a horrifying neurodegenerative condition.
Yeah. So, going from that 5th step to then the cyanobacteria exposure is your 6th step. It's a tipping point. And again, another parable for tipping points in the ecosystem. Like with the glacier, there was a tipping point where the ice had melted to the point that it was no longer classified.
Yes.
So these tipping points it again shows how biological we are, how we're a product of nature, because these tipping points happen in us just like they happen in ecosystems and around the planet as well.
And just in the manner that we are tipped toward aggression in the heat. Again, I'll never raise my hand and say it was this particular degree that made a difference between me acting as I may have in a temperate environment versus how I acted in a hot environment. And yet, at the level of the population, we know that an extra degree does matter, does constitute a tipping point for some semblant, right, for some subpopulation. And therefore, it's true of us individually as well.
Yeah. And in reading that chapter on this particular issue with cyanobacteria exposure, there is some data there showing about how this toxin can be passed up the food chain from, seafood or shellfish or fish that are living and also in ingesting organisms within that environment. So when I first read that, I thought, oh, okay, right, we just go vegan.
Yeah.
But that's not the solution, is it? Why is that?
Well, right, I mean, in part because of the airborne nature of the problem. There are all these really, again, horrifying geospatial studies that say if you conduct some kind of case-based analysis of ALS rates, you'll note that there tend to be spikes on the shores of lakes that experience these blooms, and indeed a concentration of the spikes in question downwind of where the blooms tend to arise. And we know that aerosolization of neurotoxins is a thing, that this is just something that happens. Any kind of whitecaps that you see on water that are disrupting harmful algal blooms, they've been studied to effectively contain related, though not this one, related neurotoxins that are able to travel on bubbles and travel in the air and hitch a ride on gaseous molecules. And so, you can indeed stop eating fish, for example, in the same way that mercury or methylmercury exposure is known to result from consuming too much seafood. You can limit your exposure through these dietary vectors, and it's probably not enough.
Yep. And the horrible case of the prepare yourselves brain-eating amoeba is a good example, right? And for me, it really brought home the permeability, porousness, is a phrase you used with me earlier, of ourselves versus the environment. Would you like to tell us about the amoeba situation?
Yes, I mean, I'll spend 2 words on it, and you've basically you've already said them. They eat your brain, right? So this is right. We've talked about disease vectors such as ticks and mosquitoes. We've talked about neurotoxins, which are not zoological. They're not animal-based. It's just a molecule that can cross the blood-brain barrier. But there are also literal organisms that can do the same thing. And Naegleria fowleri, which is the brain-eating amoeba in question, is a good example of that. These are organisms that lay dormant for months and months, and indeed probably years, and tend to wake up in warming freshwater sources. And what do they do after they wake up? They transition from this cystic form to a flagellated form, which is to say they can swim, and they look for a place where they can munch on nutrient-rich sources. In the case of Naegleria fowleri, a great nutrient-rich source is brain tissue. So if you jump into a warm freshwater lake, as many people are wont to do in the summer, right? This is something I loved to do as a child. I am from Minnesota, which is the state known colloquially as the land of 10,000 lakes. That is what I did as a child. And yet what we know about Naegleria fowleri is that as soon as you jump into waters that are rich in this organism, they hop into your nose, hitch a ride on the nasal nerve, cross the blood-brain barrier, and begin munching away at your brain. And you have about a week before you die. So this stuff is extremely rare, to be clear. There are like a couple hundred cases of Naegleria fowleri infections around the world every year. So don't worry. Maybe do wear a nose plug if you're going to jump into fresh water on a warm day. The problem is that those case counts are rising. And it's because waters are warming, Naegleria fowleri are likely increasing their habitable range. And those case counts are probably underestimates because when somebody presents in an emergency department, Naegleria fowleri, right, these primary amoebic encephalopathies, as they're called, PAMs, the encephalopathies present in an emergency department, basically like meningitis. They look like something that they're not. People have really severe headaches, they can't bend their neck, and so you get all these tests from pathologists for bacteria, because it looks like a severe bacterial infection. And tests come back negative on day 1 and on day 2 and day 3, and everybody's scratching their head about what is going on here. And again, by day 5, when people finally figure out that it's an amoeba, not a bacteria, it's too late, because your brain is gone by day 7. And so we do have, a decent cocktail of antimicrobials, right, and antifungals, actually, that appear to work in terms of rescuing function when you have an amoebic encephalitis. But it takes awareness on behalf of the medical community to recognize the symptomology when it presents. So we're currently missing cases. Cases are rising, unfortunately. And again, the risk is extremely small right now. But if we continue to ignore the problem, and in our medical education fail to teach doctors about the fact that this is going to become more of a problem in the future, then I think it's a dereliction of duty on behalf of society.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt that as well. But for anyone who hasn't studied neuroscience, it really illustrates just how close we are to the outside world. So that's an example of the amoeba coming in through the nose, and from there it's only 2 synapses to the brain. But your eyes, the back of your eyes, are nerve cells. So all of you looking at us right now, I can see into your brains, literally, through your eyes. And our skin has sensors in it that detect deflection and touch. So, a butterfly landing on your skin, you can sense that because your brain is in your skin. And it's just 1 synapse from there to the spinal cord and then to your brain. We're so tuned in to the world around us.
Yeah, and that, you used the word porousness earlier, and that to me is what this book is about. I know that we're talking about a lot of scary stuff right now. I actually don't think this is a particularly scary book, despite the timbre of this conversation, right? And bear with me, because I think it's actually a story of porousness. It's a story about connection. Yes, we do need to name the scariness before we confront it, but what does that scariness suggest? It suggests that we are quite close to our environment. We are not separated from the world around us, right? The fact that the world reaches in and crosses that boundary that constitutes our skin or our nasal cavity or our eyeballs, that the environment reaches in and crosses that boundary so readily, so easily, suggests that, to me, there's not this separate self that is somehow distinct from the world around us, but B suggests the fact that we can do the same thing. We can reach back out, and to me, that is what awareness of the topic affords. It affords an agency that allows us to push back in a manner that is suggestive of climate solutions, as a manner that is suggestive of recapturing some semblance of free will, right? In a manner that is capable of infusing our actions with compassion and creativity and the kind of stuff that I think is going to be essential for confronting the climate crisis, right? That there is something about the porousness itself, the lack of distinction between environment and self, that actually is suggestive of a solution. Yeah.
So you very neatly brought me on to some kind of summing up questions around zooming out from the nitty-gritty of neurodegenerative conditions. What's the solution? So what do we do about this societally, and what do we do about this personally? Two very, very big questions.
I mean, listen, societally, we need to be paying attention to this stuff. There's not a single government in the world that is pricing the neurological effects of climate change. A lot of folks, a lot of governments have come around to the public health argument that says that climate change is going to be bad for respiratory health or cardiovascular health. It's because of the spread of mosquito habitable ranges is going to increase in rising malarial case counts. And so we know that it's going to be bad for infectious disease on that front. But none of these climate economic models include any of the stuff that we've discussed today. They don't include brain disease, they don't include neurodegeneration, they certainly don't include diminished productivity costs or lack of education or increased aggression and the violence that results therein. No economic model, no cost-benefit analysis perpetrated by a government includes any of the conversation we're having. And so societally, I feel very strongly that we need to be opening our eyes here because, and I hate to put it in these terms, none of the stuff that we've discussed today is cheap. Neurological conditions are very expensive to treat, medically speaking, societally speaking. And so when governments are sluggish on climate action, frequently it's because the political will doesn't exist to further a climate solution. Why doesn't it exist? Well, A, because of lobbying, but B, because frequently the costs of climate action cannot be justified given the alleged benefits that they're going to accrue. But I think that those models are inherently flawed because we are not including the severe costs that climate change is already wreaking on neurological health. And if we were to include the offset of those costs in our benefit models of climate action, we would be taking a great leap forward in terms of the appeal of those climate solutions. So from a societal level, I think awareness is the answer as manifest in cost-benefit analysis. From a personal level, I think awareness is also the answer. And to me, what I just tried to get at in terms of the porousness, that constitutes action to me, right? There's this actually British neuroscientist named Carl Friston who has conceptualized the brain as a model. Right? What does the brain do? It scans the environment, it tries to understand the statistics of that environment, and it basically constructs a statistical model of the world around you. So as a self with conscious access to this model, you are not surprised when you encounter truths about the world that you encounter as a function of your daily life, right? If you were surprised that you have two hands or that the sky is blue, like you wouldn't be able to get anything done. You would just be shocked that the world is perceptually rich as it is. So instead, what your brain as model is doing is saying, don't pay attention to the stuff that you expect. Pay attention to the stuff that you don't expect. That's the moment that learning occurs. That's the moment when the model adjustment occurs, when you're surprised, when you notice something new about the world. And what I'm arguing in this book is that this modeling effort, which is in all of us and operating all the time, it constitutes that reaching out. It constitutes the relationship between environment and self. It is that which brings the environment into us, but, and this is the important point, what Friston argues is that while we can understand the world reaching in as a set of sensations and our actions as a response to those sensations as a kind of pushback, you can also flip the equation around. And you can understand your own actions as the world's sensations. That mathematically this is true. That when we act, that when we navigate the world and make decisions and adjust our behavior, when we act, right, mathematically speaking, that's the same thing as describing what the environment is perceiving of us. And that, to me, that statement is enough to recapture agency. I think so much of the conversation about climate change depresses agency. It constricts it. It says we are not making choices as we are imagining making choices. If I am prone to violence in a way on a hot day that I may not have been on a temperate day, right? Where's the free will in that decision? And yet I think that compassion can be recaptured. Agency can be recaptured in our conscious access to this model, in our conscious access to an understanding of these effects. And so that's why I harp on awareness so much. It's why I harp on mindfulness so much. What is mindfulness as a practice, other than, kind of a series of new age words strung together? meditation and mindful presence and noticing and acceptance and the ability to name one's internal experience and then move on from that experience, neurologically, those practices really matter in terms of cognitive health, right? Functional connectivity between these decision-making centers in the brain, right? It's boosted as a function of mindfulness practices. And again, what is mindfulness other than awareness literally embodied? So I know, I'm kind of rambling here and maybe ranting at maybe that's the half beer that I've consumed, but I do think that there is something to be said for reclaiming agency as a function of awareness of the issues in question, that fear does not need to be our response here. In fact, awareness can afford climate action. It can afford a reaching back out, a pushing back against the forces that are acting on us.
Thanks, Clay. You've summed up entirely what I thought could be the final point that we end on around agency, around reclaiming our agency. This is not a book about climate anxiety. It even says that on the fold. Nevertheless, it's something that we do have to touch on. It's something that a lot of people in the room will be feeling. It's something that I have felt pretty much every day since I read that IPCC report.
Yes.
And what I've been doing myself for the last 15 years is trying to reclaim agency in the small ways that I can, in the spheres that I have some influence over. So in my academic work as a neuroscientist, I set up this sustainability chapter for neuroscientists to measure the carbon footprint of our MRI scanning research. And we've just found a way to save 50% of carbon emissions just by tweaking a setting in some of our analysis. So, and often you will hear people saying, oh, but it's up to the government. Well, yes, of course, but they don't understand my work. They don't know how an MRI scanner works. We understand our own communities. We understand our own work. And that's where we have a sphere of influence. So it might feel really small, but it's helped keep me topped up because I feel like I'm doing something in my sphere of expertise and influence. And there will be an equivalent of that for everyone here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and you are probably actually a great case study in terms of this paper that came out last week that effectively shows that the most climate anxious among us, particularly those of us who feel a kind of cognitive or emotional relationship to the problem, those of us who aren't getting, stopped or isolated or somewhat, ruminative and paralyzed by the climate problem, those who are the most climate anxious along that emotional axis are actually those who are most likely to engage in pro-environmental behavior. That actually the ability to recognize the threats in question, to be able to look into the future and its embodied uncertainty and say, yes, this is scary, but I'm going to respond with action, that appears to be a relatively reliable response, and maybe even one that is afforded by a very specific mode of neurology. That when you look at the most climate concerned versus those who express smaller degrees of climate anxiety, and this is correcting for the trait of anxiety writ large or generalized anxiety disorder, if you compare those with greater degrees of climate anxiety to those with lesser degrees of climate anxiety, you find in that former group in the brain, a smaller region of the brain known as the mid-cingulate cortex. What is that responsible for? It's responsible for effectively looking at future uncertain threats. So this part of the brain is smaller. That's kind of strange. But it's more densely connected to another chunk of brain that's known as the salience network. And this is effectively that which is responsible for attending to many different things in space. How do you understand what's important about the world? And so the combination of those two findings would suggest that people with greater levels of climate concern actually have potentially more efficient wiring in that mid-cingulate cortex. It's smaller, but it's more densely connected to salience. And so what is that affording in these people? It's probably affording an ability to recognize the severity of the problem, determine that it is indeed a relevant threat to society, and then, given the pro-environmental behavior finding, respond appropriately. So actually, Dr. Ray, you may be the perfect model for what constitutes a response to climate change that imbues us with a sense of agency as opposed to a sense of paralysis.
Yeah.